The Winnipeg Jets offseason is still underway, and while a lot of folks are focused on the present, I thought it would be worth taking a step back and talking about the future of the Jets, more specifically, when Winnipeg's next competitive window is. It's a tough question, and it depends on a lot of things going right for Winnipeg's talented and promising pool of prospects. But we'll dive into all of this on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. But most of all, we just love and appreciate your support. Now, like I said, tonight's episode, I want to focus on the future of the Jets, right? It's something we've talked about off and on because the present right now is still static. There have been some rumors that the Jets are not quite done with the trade market, but let's be real. Unless the Jets get a very good offer or, really surprise us, I think until at least the trade deadline or maybe even the start of the season, Winnipeg's going to be on the quiet side. I think Winnipeg's offseason is, I wouldn't say complete, but at least in terms of major moves, probably put on pause for now. So it kind of then comes down to the future of the Jets. And I think this is where you have a lot of very high-level questions. The direction of the team, we have some insight into their philosophy. We've gotten more of a clear sense of what the Jets are interested in building around. And I think the biggest question is, after all is said and done, right? Say all these prospects hit their peak, they all reach their full potential and become, stud NHLers. When is Winnipeg's next competitive window? And for me, I think it's going to be around 4 years from now. I think in about 4 seasons, the Jets are going to have a very promising group of players who, quite honestly, should be just about towards the end of their ELCs. I think a number of these players are going to start filtering into the NHL over the next 2 seasons. Maybe 3 for some. There are a few players who are probably a little further off. Colby Barlow, I don't know that I count him in that group, even though he's like 17, right? I think Barlow might be a player who graduates to the pro game a little bit faster than some of his peers. But a guy like McGroarty might be another 2 seasons away. Lambert maybe another 2 seasons away. I think that they'll want to apply their trade first at the AHL level and really prove that they are ready to take the next step. Now, Lambert has an okay chance of perhaps graduating faster. McGroarty, I don't know what his game is going to translate to at the pro level just because he's still working on stuff like his skating mechanics. He is improving on that day by day. We saw really big strides from him compared to where he was, at draft versus what we saw in training camp. So I think that there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about his progression. I think Lambert's progression looks good. We have a number of players, Salamanson, who I think is also showing some nice things. At the end of the day, though, right, perhaps the biggest question is, say the competitive window is in like 4 years or so. What is the team going to look like? And I think it really comes down to how the Jets want to build out this roster because you can have all of these ELCs, but you still need a veteran backbone, right? Players who are kind of still really productive, probably still in their prime, and have experience to help lead a young, talented crop. Not that you have to do it this way, but I think if you're the Jets, right, this is traditionally what you did when you had really good teams like the 2014-15 squad and the 2017-2018 team, right? You want to have a couple of like really core players, and then the ELCs sort of fill in the gaps around it, right? Providing you surplus value, giving you room to make deadline acquisitions, and giving you, a really strong couple of seasons where you can potentially build a perennial playoff, contender. But I think the Jets, for me, the last time really failed to do that. It felt like the Jets captured lightning in a bottle and then struggled to figure out how to translate that level of success into something that was really sustainable. And I think it showed in a big way as, the seasons kind of rolled on. And Winnipeg just seemingly lost touch with victory. And it sounds strange to say because, it wasn't that the Jets were the worst team in the NHL. They weren't. I might say that they were like really middle of the pack, but in terms of like just god awful, no. I think the Jets were kind of like an average team in a lot of areas. They were below average at some things, but they were also decent at a couple of other key areas, right? Maybe one year they might be really good at the power play, maybe not so good at even strength. One year, maybe great goaltending and, a stronger team defensive effort, but a lack of scoring, which is kind of this past season. And so, I think the Jets are really figuring out all of the ways that you have talent and don't make the most of it, which is kind of a shame because I felt like that was a lesson that they could have avoided. The 2017-2018 team not becoming more successful beyond that season really is a shame. And I think, for one season or two seasons, the Jets had the right idea about how you build a winner that can come back and keep doing it. But then they stopped with that whole plan, and it just feels like the Jets fell off after that. So, for the future, I'm really looking ahead towards a team that's going to be really skilled. I think Winnipeg is going to have a lot of really good characters in the room, and I think the Jets are going to establish a better culture. I think that's really important. And one of those things that I think is really important to establish is a culture of accountability. In a little bit, I want to talk about why I think that is a particular issue for the Jets and how it can really help change, the Jets for the better. I think Winnipeg is starting to move towards it, but there's still, some steps that they're going to want to take and some things that, quite frankly, the organization needs to do in order to reach that next phase of transparency and really getting guys on the same page. I think if you get everyone bought in to the vision and future of this team, I think it's going to get a lot of people excited. But before we talk about all of that fun stuff and why accountability is really important, I did want to shout out and be accountable to our wonderful sponsors at FanDuel. Football season is about to kick off, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to win all season long. Right now, when you bet on the Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every time they win in the regular season. Sounds like a pretty good deal if you ask me. Just pick any team to win the Super Bowl, and you'll get bonus bets for every single victory. Say, if you're like me and you're a Ravens fan, well, you're probably expecting to have more than your fair share of bonus bets awarded. You can use your bonus bets on things like spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. Maybe the number of times the Minnesota Vikings are going to break a lot of your hearts. Just kidding a little bit. But no matter what team you support or who you root for, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and start earning bonus bets right now with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee. Thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode of Locked On Jets. We were talking, briefly about Winnipeg's competitive window, which is a very nebulous thing, right? We're talking very high level. 4 years down the road is kind of my gut feeling, right? And it does depend on how they build out the contract extensions for some of their veteran players, like Ehlers, Connor. Those guys are running out. We know that Scheifele and Hellebuck are still very much in the lurch with their contract statuses. So, I think 4 years for me, it's not, the most secure of gambles and bets that I want to make, but I feel like it's reasonable given where the team is and how the Jets have approached this stuff previously. But I think one of the biggest, parts of this future of this team is going to come down to a change in the culture. And we've talked about it before, Winnipeg being viewed as a very toxic team. A lot of veteran players who have come through here have complained about it. And, I think to some degree, maybe it's been a little bit overstated for the Jets because there's not really much else that you find fault with Winnipeg. All of these other teams have like some really bad controversies. With Winnipeg, it's kind of like a normal, almost, generational divide. Guys who view the team needing to be run one way versus somebody else's version. And it's, not that different from corporate politics, just very sportsy related. So I think for the Jets, one of the biggest things that's missing is accountability, right? When the team doesn't do well, when players struggle, it feels like only some voices are speaking up and suggesting that things aren't as they should be. And I feel like for Winnipeg, I'd want to see more from the leadership saying, this isn't good enough. We need to, push harder, and maybe even imply that they need more support from the front office. Obviously, they're not going to do that because, for one thing, you ain't calling out your boss in a press conference. That just doesn't happen, much less with hockey players who are usually pretty reserved as it is. But I feel like, take Neil Pionk, for example. I feel like he maybe pushed his own criticism a little too far when he described his like season last year, was it, as embarrassing. I felt like that was, maybe a little uncharitable. Neil went through some stuff with injuries and whatnot. And look, even if we feel his performance isn't good, it's not like he isn't trying really hard every game, right? It's just sometimes the results don't always align. So I think for me, while I might not, love the way that he talked about his own assessment, I think the most important thing is that Pionk is speaking up anyways and saying that he feels he wasn't contributing in the way that he wants to. And so that for me, I think is a positive thing if it's used in the right way. And I think for the Jets, they really drafted a lot of guys who feel like they're going to be more on that sort of the end of the spectrum of accountability. And I think it's really important because if the leaders in the team and in the room are holding themselves to a higher standard, other players will follow that. You might not notice it at first, but I do think, there's going to be more team spirit. I think you're going to have stronger connection and chemistry. And I think it's going to make the team perform at a higher level. Maybe even, even if it's like a marginal improvement, right? Just knowing that players are aware, knowing that they're understanding that things could improve and that ultimately they want to fight for the badge and for the fans. I think it's a really good thing. Because like when you look at Winnipeg and you look at this market, right? Jets fans love the team and love the players like few other fan bases. And so I think forging that accountability would get not only fans back on board, but also ticket sales back on board. I think that is something to where if the fan base really feels like there's a direction and that the Jets are actually pushing and building towards something, maybe you finally get fan buy-in. I know ticket sales and renewals haven't exactly been great, but look, this team has an intriguing future. It's one that's very high risk and perhaps a little bit hard to be optimistic about, in the sense that if I'm being honest and giving you like an old bull crap assessment, look, it's going to be really hard for the Jets to have the kind of future that we've talked about because, you need every one of these players that they've drafted to essentially make the NHL. And there's no guarantee. Very few prospects, when you look at the whole, actually make the NHL consistently. You might get a couple of games, maybe a cup of coffee, but when you're talking about full-time, full-duty starting lineup NHLers, how often do you really think they actually make it? It's a very, very, very small percentage, especially outside of like the top 5 or top 10 picks. So for the Jets, I think, it's really important to find other ways to compensate and really bring good leadership into the team, but without sacrificing skill and stuff. I know that that's something that the excuse me, that the Jets have done in the past. Every now and again, I feel that they've brought in a really good voice and a really good character, but maybe not somebody who's able to, match up those words with the sort of performance and action on the ice that you would really expect. And so this crop of prospects, I am feeling reasonably good about. I feel like there's a good work ethic. It seems like they're really personable. They've connected with the fans already in a way that I really love. And it feels like, and I don't know them personally, but it does feel like they're going to be more accountable. It feels like they're going to hold the team to a higher standard. And the fact that they get along early on and are making friends, I think is a good sign because, sometimes the best criticism and the one that really wakes you up is when somebody who you care about and who cares about you is delivering that news, right? And if those guys keep themselves accountable, really hold each other to a higher standard, and really ask more from one another, I feel like it'll make a lot of questions for me kind of move towards the wayside. And look, I'm not saying that spirit and morale and all that is enough to carry the Jets to victory, but I think it'd be a start. If nothing else, you just want to establish a culture that's inviting, that's, good for players who are used to other winning organizations. Maybe you consider them to give Winnipeg another chance. We are often talking about how free agents hate Winnipeg, who don't want to come here. Maybe if you have a culture change and really foster a good community sense, maybe other players are going to take a look at the Jets and say, you know what, maybe there's something to that team that ain't so half bad. But of course, there is one other area where I think the Jets could stand to improve, and it's perhaps going against the nice community aspect that I just talked about, at least in some areas, maybe not so much in others. Of course, I'm talking about aggression, and we'll talk about how the Jets can do that both in the front office and on the ice in just a little bit. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for joining us on these closing thoughts in tonight's episode of Locked On Jets. Just wanted to wrap up our discussion of the future Winnipeg success and really the next competitive window and how I think the Jets can make the most of it. I've talked about accountability being one thing. I've talked about some of the young talent and building around that with a good veteran spine, a quality veteran spine. A third thing, and perhaps the final point that we'll talk about tonight, is that I think the Jets need aggression. And I don't just mean physical aggression, right? That's kind of one thing that I know a lot of Jets fans have talked about, adding size and grit and physicality. With the Jets, I don't think the team is nearly as small as people make them out to be, and they're not as soft as people think they are. This is a pretty rough and tumble Jets team, and they're not afraid to mix it up. They will throw pretty heavy checks, and they're like the 5th or 7th tallest team in the league. So size-wise, the Jets are actually not that small. When I talk about aggression, though, I mean adding pressure on the ice, right? Creating waves of sustained pressure. That's something that the Jets used to do, and we've talked about how the blue line can activate, how forwards can support each other down low. That is where you force your opponents to make mistakes. And I think aggression from the Jets would go a long way towards also kind of covering up the fact that, let's be real, the Jets don't have as much finishing talent as some of the top-end contenders, right? This team isn't nearly as deep as Vegas. It maybe lacks a little bit of the flash of like Florida Panthers, and maybe doesn't have nearly as much elite talent as the Avs Cup winners have had. But you know what? This Jets team still has the tools and a pretty decent top 9, at least to create some waves of pressure and force your opponents to make mistakes. If the Jets can consistently do that more often and get more support from the back end, it might give not only Hellebuck a little bit of a breather, but also the defense, right? The defense, we know, it's not the worst in the NHL, but it's certainly not quite what you would expect for such an expensive unit. The Jets pay a lot of money for a blue line that has struggled to live up to expectations. So, you know what? If the Jets can't really defend as well as they'd like, maybe they can attack a little bit better, be more aggressive, close off space. I don't mind the Jets taking risks if it's sensible, right? You know, don't do something really stupid where you go for a pinch on a hit and it's very obvious that you're out of position, you're going to miss, and there's just no real incentive to do it, right? Better to try and at least fend off the 2-on-1 or odd man situation than just go for a hit that maybe doesn't actually separate the puck carrier from the puck. But in other areas, I don't mind the Jets attacking and jumping into the rush more frequently, maybe being a little bit more ambitious, carrying the puck down low, doing stuff like that. If you're doing productive motions and trying to create more offense, I don't mind taking risks. But it'd also be nice if that risk-taking extended to the front office. I feel like the front office over the years has this very conservative approach. And look, I get it. You know, internally there's a budget. I know that they're also sensitive to the fact that Winnipeg hasn't always been the most premier destination for a lot of free agents and players who have to, waive trade clauses. But look, the front office can do a better job than it's done over the years. This team kind of threw away one of the best cores we've ever seen. And I'm not saying that in like a damning sense, right? I'm not trying to like throw everyone under the bus here, but we're just being honest, right? The Jets had an amazing team and they just didn't know how to make it last. And that is a real shame because like I felt like in my heart of hearts that team was going to win a cup. I really felt that. And of course, I think a lot of people felt that way. I think we all knew the Jets were the best team that year. And you know exactly what season I'm talking about. But, I think the Jets can reach lofty heights again if they play the trade market a little more aggressively, make use of their assets, and make use of, some interesting opportunities, right? Maybe you take on a bad contract if you're trying to acquire some futures. Maybe you look at, changing out contracts, adding depth, and trying to shore up your ranks so that you have fewer players who people, call weaklings, right? Vegas is a really deep team. They don't have, superstar talent on every single line, but they have guys who at worst are above replacement level. And I think that makes a really big difference when you're talking about a team built that way versus how the Jets are, which is, look, I love Stenlund. He was a fun guy, but players like him don't really promote offense at the level that you'd hope. He could do it sometimes, and he had some nice goals, But on a consistent basis, right, is he really going to be, one of your breadwinners? You need a little bit more from your bottom six and a little bit more from your depth players. And I think that's where the front office really needs to work on it. And also, on the defense, right, the blue line is kind of a mess. It's not really where it should be. And the Jets could stand to do with some improvements there. But the only way that they're going to accomplish that is if they finally start to get a little more active on the market and actually do stuff that's more than just putting irons in the fire. Make those irons go to work for you. And that's perhaps Winnipeg's next big evolution. But I'd be curious to know what you think the Jets need to do. How do you see their competitive window shaping up? When do you think it's going to hit? And what do you think the Jets need to do to prepare for that? Leave your thoughts in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. But for tonight's show, that is all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. I can't wait to see you here back tomorrow for another episode. So as always, like, follow, and subscribe. Have a great night, and go Jets go.